Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about a potentially looming problem for the Biden administration. This was surrounding the rail systems, which moves a majority of the commerce that we have in the United States. It moves not only products and goods, but oil and gas and everything else. There was a strike looming, and this has been talked about and been an ongoing problem for a couple of months. And the Biden administration was seemingly running down the clock and made a last-minute and late decision late last week. To give us some more details on that this morning is Andrew Donaldson. He's over at Young Voices and The Ordinary Times. Andrew, good morning, sir. Can you explain how we got to this point with this rail strike and where everything stands right now?
Absolutely, and appreciate the time this morning. We'll disagree with you on one thing. This wasn't a last-minute thing. This was their plan for a couple of months now. Let's back up. The reason they jumped in on this is these negotiations have been going on for 3 years. These rail unions have 5-year windows when they can do their collective bargaining. This has been going on for about 3 years, and COVID happened right in the middle of it. So that's what brought up a lot of these issues like the sick time stuff. So back up to September when the White House intervened. The reason they intervened in September is they didn't want a rail strike in September, October, because the transportation schedule runs a little bit ahead of the commerce schedule. So all the stuff for Christmas was in transit August, September, October. So they didn't want a railroad and freight shut down then because that would screw up Christmas. It would also mess up the forthcoming election, of course. So they intervened. Marty Walsh, Labor Secretary in the White House, brokered a deal between the union heads and the companies. Now, it's step one of a two-step process, but what they knew would happen is because the unions themselves have to vote and ratify on that, and there's a mandatory cooling-off period, the way the collective bargaining is, they knew by doing that it pushed it past the November election, which is exactly what happened. So then we had what happened here last week where, okay, the unions, they got past the election. Three and four of the unions rejected this deal, but it was actually the two of the bigger ones. So it was about half of the rail workers rejected this deal. They decided to strike. They were going to go on strike December the 9th. And the White House used Congress's delineated power from the 1926 Rail Labor Act, how's that one for a blast from the past, to intervene and force arbitration to take the September agreement. That's what got it here. So this whole thing was the White House kicked it past the election. Then they wanted to kick it past Christmas because they don't want a rail strike right before Christmas. Now they've kicked it down the road again. I think that's going to come back and bite them, but that's how we got to where we are today.
Andrew Donaldson is our guest this morning. You just mentioned, you said a rail act from 1926. So explain to me how exactly the federal government can step in and jump between workers and their private unions. I don't understand.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? So this Labor Rail Act back in 1926, when the unions first became unionized, and of course, that's the primary transportation for the whole country. Remember, air travel hasn't really started up yet. This is, the most vital transportation sector in the country outside of shipping. They set up this law. Now, this isn't what it was really intended for. It was actually intended to broker labor negotiations between unions and management. The way they used it here, though, was they did the negotiation between the union and management. But then while the unions were all voting for it, Congress just stepped in and said, oh, you have to take this brokered deal between the union heads and the management and override what the rank and file labor guys said. It is a power Congress had. This isn't exactly what it was designed to be, but the Biden administration and Congress knew they had this in their back pocket to shut down this labor shortage. And again, it is going to be a major economic impact. You're talking about $2 billion a day. If the freight rail shuts down, that would also shut down the ports. It would also greatly affect trucking. It would be an economic disaster. That's the calculus. That's why they pulled out the big stick, and that's why they used that law.
Yeah, I saw a comment last week from Pete Buttigieg about how there's not enough trucks and everything else to even scratch the surface if there was truly a rail strike, and it looks like that is going to be averted. So let me ask you this, though, Andrew. President Joe Biden, every time he talks and makes up some story about his time as a young boy or in his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, he always talks about how he's big union Joe and he's blue-collar Joe and he loves the unions. Seemingly here, though, he sided not with the unions, but sided with the companies. And for the workers that were ready to strike, well, they might not necessarily be happy with this agreement. Is that what you're taking away from it?
No, they're beyond upset about it because for a lot of reasons. That statement that came out of the White House last Wednesday where he said, well, I'm a big labor guy, but I said at the time, I said, this is 151 proof Joe Biden. They should carve this into the wall of his presidential library that's going to go into Delaware or wherever, because this is exactly what 50 years of Joe Biden is. He's all shucks and all this, and then when it comes down to it, he does the politically calculated thing. This is a math problem. There's a couple 100,000 rail workers. There's 200 some odd million registered voters that were going to get really upset if the economy got shut down in an election year. Because remember, we're already on the 2024 election cycle now for Joe Biden running for re-election. That's the calculus. The rail workers got screwed. These are people who expect the Democratic Party to be on their side. And look, I'm not the biggest big labor guy. I got my issues with organized labor. Railroad workers got a legitimate grievance here. They really did get screwed.
So let's talk about their grievances. Our guest is Andrew Donaldson this morning. He's over at Young Voices and the Ordinary Times. Let's talk about why this, and you mentioned this is not something new. It's been brewing over the summer, but it really all picked up steam in the last couple of weeks. Why were the railroad workers looking to strike? What was their big holdout? At least a couple of these unions, CSX and others, were holding out. What was their problem? What were they asking for?
It's very clear. Sick time. And this goes, remember, I said this could go back 3 years. This goes back to COVID because these workers do not get delineated sick time. They get PTO and other things, but folks got to remember PTO and things like that, that is at the discretion of the companies. They can penalize you for that. They can deny you the time off for it. Sick time, you can't be penalized and they can't deny it to you, right? So when COVID happened, these folks have long hours, a lot of travel. It's a hard job to schedule for the companies. They don't want to give up that power. They get penalized strongly for their attendance policies. So when COVID happens and they start getting sick and their family members get sick and their kids get sick and all this stuff and they don't have sick time, that's what brought all this to a head. So this is actually something that got left over from the COVID era. They're not going to let this go. And now that they got forced into this, here's what you need to do. Everybody needs to dog ear this story and keep an eye on it. So this goes back to the agreement from 3 years ago. So they're going to get back pay and benefits from this agreement. That'll take about 60 days, and it's about 2 years until they can start the next negotiation period. From 60 days from now, when they get that back pay from 2 years from now, watch the attendance and the employment levels of this field. See if there's an exodus. See if people start leaving it, because this is a field that's lost about 30% of its workforce over the last 6 years. These folks might vote with their feet. That's what you got to watch out for, and that's why the Biden administration, they got their quick fix win. They probably made this problem much worse in the long term.
Well, I would imagine, I will admit I don't have any experience working in the rail, and I don't even think I know anybody closely. I have a distant cousin that I think works in rail. But Andrew, you bring up that this is not the sexiest of jobs in the world. You're talking about long hours, schedules all over the place, probably some significant time away from home from time to time. I mean, it's not necessarily the most lucrative job in the world, and but as we know, it is an incredibly important industry. You talked earlier about the economic impacts. Is it safe? Is it a safe assessment to claim that the United States would not be able to operate without rail as it is right now?
Completely accurate. You're talking 40% off all goods and services and mercantile. That includes raw stuff like oil. That all moves by rail. And we saw when the ports shut down, what happens when the ports shut down? If the rail system shuts down, the ports shut down again. Trucking cannot pick up what the rail folks do. And rail's actually already under strain because things like in the Mississippi corridor, the river boats, the river's been down so much, they've been putting extra stuff on rail because they haven't been able to do some of the intercoastal shipping stuff that they need to do with the water levels. This is something that's already under a heavy amount of strain. We already have a kind of an iffy economy in certain sectors. We've already seen some transportation interruptions over the last couple of years. This scared the White House a lot, and it should have, and that's why they reacted so strongly and so quickly on this. If rail shuts down, you're going to have a very big problem here, and that's why I'm telling you, you need to dog-ear this story. In a couple of years, if we have more labor problems with the railroad, don't be all shocked and shaken. Remember, things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a sequence. And this is going to be a watershed moment for these workers and for this industry.
Andrew Donaldson is our guest this morning. I want to go back to something you mentioned about these workers. One of the rail union bosses told CNBC late last week that there is going to be some election consequences, and, quote, we will remember who sided against us in upcoming elections. That's a pretty strong statement from an organization and a group which typically, not always the fact, but typically big unions side with the Democrat Party. That is not a new conversation, not a new topic. Nope. That's a pretty strong statement there.
It is. And remember, again, things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in sequence. Let's go back. The voters that Trump swung in the Rust Belt, a lot of those are old union folks or traditionally union households. You know, those kind of blue-collar workers, maybe a little more socially conservative, but still grew up in union households. We've seen places like West Virginia, traditional labor strongholds that have flipped red. The only thing here is, remember, unions are on the decline. This is a smaller and smaller percentage of the work. And things like the Biden White House, they just made the calculations like, yeah, I know this is one of our core constituencies, but it's a smaller constituency than massive amounts of the country. So when push came to shove, he took the bigger group of voters, which is the entire country, over these workers. I can see where they're aggrieved. I don't blame them. If I was them, I'd quit giving them money too. But we'll have to wait and see because there's a lot of entanglements there. I'll believe it when I see it that they're actually going to walk away from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Joe Biden here for a minute. Obviously, the guy has got no morals, no standards, and no consistency. You can look at an audio clip, 48 hours apart, and he says two completely different things. This one, though, is very interesting because Andrew, his whole life story is how he's blue-collar union Joe, and his dad worked for, I believe his dad worked for a car dealership or something like that. That's at least what he's told us. And he was a big union family and everything else. I mean, he really just stabbed these people in the back.
It's more than that. It's very personal for these guys because remember, he's not just, Scranton Joe and Sheriff Joe and Uncle Joe. He's Amtrak Joe. Remember, he built his whole brand on riding the train home every weekend.
Oh, yeah.
And to be fair, he did have, remember the tragedy with his first wife and then dying and raising his boys and that his family story. He went home every weekend on the train. He built up a 50-year brand on riding the train. So when you listen to some of these rail workers talk, he's like, well, wait a minute. He's the guy that we've affected the most out of all these guys. He's the guy that's always on the train. He did campaign appearances at train stations. This is a core part of his public persona. So for these rail workers, it's even more personal than that. Let's not forget that part of it.
Yeah, it's personal. And the unfortunate reality of this, Andrew, and we saw this with some of the COVID lockdowns and everything else, is there's so much going on in the country. We're in such a quick information and news cycle that it's hard for something like this. You mentioned 2 years, at least 2 years away from negotiations beginning again. That's a really long time. And unfortunately, we have really short attention spans with the fast moving news industry.
This is a great example of how we have not correctly dealt with and or analyzed the COVID era, because look at how this story broke. Look how many lines this crossed. It's a traditional labor thing for one political party, but their own political party went. This all goes back to COVID. These sick days, this came to a head during COVID when they couldn't get the time off for COVID, when you're mandatory that you have to take 10 days off or whatever the waiting periods are. We still have not fully dealt with how COVID is going to affect things like politics and these traditional things going forward. And it's something we really, really need to pay attention to and learn that lesson. Andrew,
you're over at the Ordinary Times. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Ordinary-Times, we have a great group of writers all across the spectrum, so you're going to read some stuff that upsets you, but that's okay. That's how grown folks learn things. Really talented folks, and then I also have my own podcast and show, Heard Tell, and I get to represent young voices, a great group of really talented folks that you'll see all over media these days. And I'm just thrilled and blessed to get to do all of it. And it's great to finally get to talk to you. I've heard you in Wilmington for years. Nice to finally talk to you, my friend.
Well, I appreciate the time this morning. I look glad to make connection with you, and I'm sure we'll catch up again real soon.
Anytime, my friend.
Thank you. Andrew Donaldson joining us this morning, giving us the recap, the 411 rundown on this rail worker strike that the Biden administration seemingly ran out the clock on. The strike would have begun this Friday, the 9th, had Congress not intervened using some obscure law from the mid-1920s to usurp themselves in between the unions and the workers, the unions and the laborers, and just to see how that's all unfolded. Rail unions and the rail workers not getting what they wanted, and the Biden administration seemingly beating their chests and acting as if they got a win. We'll now have to see what the ramifications of pro-union blue-collar Joe and some of the ramifications of this, as once again, the current president and the current administration says one thing, as Andrew just highlighted, makes his entire brand about being middle-class, Scranton, train-riding Joe, and then when push comes to shove, he completely screws over the railroad workers. And that, while that sounds surprising and shocking, this is, ladies and gentlemen, par for the course for this guy. This is par for the course for the Democrat Party. This is not a unbelievable thing that we're talking about this morning. This is what they do. There's no standards. There's no morals. Nothing. It's all about getting the next quick political hit and next political win. And I think that is why you're starting to see so many people being disenfranchised from the Democrat Party. And so many people saying, you know what? Enough is enough. I'm done. Yes, I voted for Democrats for the last 40 years, but not doing it anymore. They've lied to me. They've lied to my family. They've lied to my friends. Look at what's going on in West Virginia with coal miners right now. And now hundreds of thousands of rail workers in the United States not getting the deal that they wanted because Joe Biden would rather get a quick political win than back the unions, which he claims he's such a big fan of.